Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This episode of CTO Confessions is brought to you by the one and only IT Labs. And your host today is me, TC Gill, IT Labs Chief Talking Officer, and I'm speaking from London, UK. So, Catherine, welcome to CTO Confessions. It's great to have you on board.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Brilliant. So tell the audience a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And who do you work for?
I'm Kat Miller, and I am Chief Technical Officer of Flatiron Health.
And out of curiosity, what does Flatiron Health do? What's the problem they're solving in the market?
Yeah, so Flatiron Health has a mission to improve and extend lives of people who are living with cancer. And what that really breaks down to is there's a couple different components of that. It's obviously in healthcare, it's in oncology, and one component is that we have an electronic health record, which is the tool that doctors use on a day-to-day basis in interacting with their patients and understanding and figuring out their treatment. So that's one component. And from that, we also have built a data business. So you can think about this as there are tens of millions of people with cancer at any given time. Clinical trials only capture a very small percentage of it and a very privileged group. And so the patients that we actually learn from, the people who we learn from are people who don't look like the rest of us, and also is like a very small proportion. So if we can learn and gain, insights from everyone who is going through that experience, we can speed research, we can decrease time to market for new drugs, we can avoid maybe more catastrophic issues. So that's the fundamental idea, is like you've got this data, and if you can make it available for research, that's a huge win. And then there's kind of a third prong, which is, okay, you've got these two sides. You've got the point of care where people are being treated, and you've got this sort of data insights piece, bridging them together to make clinical trials themselves better, faster, stronger, which is a long road to be on. But I think those are like kind of the key components of the strategy. And the problem we're solving is basically we don't learn fast enough in our healthcare system.
Yes, yeah. I'm a big fan of feedback loops. I think all healthy systems have good feedback loops, and that allows us to adapt and adjust. So who kind of uses this data? So you get the data, and then do you kind of make conclusions from that and then provide those conclusions back?
So our key customers on the data side are pharmaceutical companies developing drugs, and they're using them in their medical and scientific organizations to understand where is their unmet need. In some cases, they're using them to say, hey, there's a thing that we either can't run a trial on because it's not ethical. We didn't run a trial on because we're not sure it's cost effective, but we think there's an opportunity area where we could expand the usage of this drug to people, it would be more beneficial for folks. So there's like a wide variety all the way from kind of drug discovery and figuring out what molecules they should be going after, all the way to, a drug is approved and marketed, but there's more opportunity there, or understanding comparative effectiveness. So they're a big customer, but we also work with academic partners and other research scientists to basically, have them also have a go at the data, for their particular, in research interests. And so there's kind of two sides. Obviously, there's a self-interest on the pharma side, but I also think, their self-interest is like, let's get the drugs, like if there are people who can benefit from this, like, let's figure it out. And I do think that speeding drug development is something that benefits everyone. It certainly benefits pharma, but it also hugely benefits patients.
Yes.
So I think we're in a lucky situation where we're kind of in a win-win.
Yeah, I love that. So Catherine, that sounds excellent. And it sounds like a very purposeful business. It must feel quite good to be using tech to actually change people's lives. I mean, it's very purposeful.
Yeah, I mean, I think myself and many of the people who work here were looking for something where, we aren't interested in doing ad tech. We didn't want to, sell another widget, but the idea of like doing something that actually moves the needle for a major problem in our ecosystem. I'm a systems person, so I'm really interested in places where systems are breaking down and where there are opportunities, to make those better systemically, holistically.
Yes. And from what I've heard, we've got the famous NHS service that we have here, the health system, and I can't help feeling that doesn't have enough feedback loops. It doesn't have enough learning and reflecting back how things have gone so we can improve them. I not being in the States, is that something that's in your space as well?
Yeah, I mean, you have the advantage in the NHS in that you're not as fragmented as we are here. Obviously, in the States, where we don't have a single payer system, we don't have a single network of care, the information is itself fragmented, which is certainly part of why Flatiron exists. But we also actually, have a branch in the UK side, and it's because the raw data is insufficient. you just pull out a health record or 10 health records and you're like, here, use this. It's actually not very usable without quite a bit of work. And I think that's where, it's a thing that I think makes people uncomfortable, but the idea that you really need some sort of business interest to sort of front the money and front the investment to get that to a place where it is valuable, where it is information, is one of those things where you need to find where the incentives align so that you can effectively pay for that curation and get the societal benefit by figuring out, what the commercial benefit it is. And that's not so different from things in climate change or other areas. So, the NHS is helpful in that, there's more centralization, although, not as much as people might think.
Yes.
There are, different systems are used different places. It's, it's not quite as harmonious, but it's certainly a less fragmented beast than the States is.
But it's great to hear, again, from a tech leader that technology being used in a very generative way rather than an extractive way. It's actually tech being used for good, if you want to put it that way.
And it's been a North Star we've always had in our minds of if patients knew exactly how their data is being used, would that sink the company or would that be something where they'd be excited and say like, yeah, I think that's a good idea. And I think we know not from our surveys, but from public surveys that people want their information to benefit the next wave of people. They honestly want what they've gone through to be meaningful. And this is, one small way in which that can be true. If our entire life experience could go towards helping people with the same problems, I think we'd all be in on that.
And the audience can't see you, but I can see the passion actually in your expressions, in your face. You really love this. You really love the difference this makes.
Certainly, I was certainly looking to be in healthcare, and I was looking to be in healthcare in a place where there's a lot of Band-Aid solutions. There are a lot of things that are good ideas and they will make someone's life better, but they do not fundamentally change the scale. And when I think about drug development, I think about where the United States might be going in terms of how we pay for drug development. I think it's very scary to think about the incentives, the way that R&D works, the payment system, and realize that, there's a little bit of a house of cards going on and there's a risk appetite, which is very low for obvious reasons. But I say risk appetite, not in terms of like giving molecules to patients that would be unsafe, but if you're a pharma company and you're doing a drug development, your primary goal is to find some place where that drug is a positive benefit so you can get your drug onto market.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly rational. But it means that things like innovations in how you find those patients or what kind of criteria you put on those patients are very difficult to enact because your primary goal is to not fail.
Yes.
And so, I think there's just so much opportunity in this system. And that's what I get passionate about, right? There's like so much there in terms of, if you were designing it from scratch and you were designing an incentive system, this would not be what you come up with.
Yeah. Yes. So I want to focus now on put the spotlight back on you and your kind of journey. I'm really curious around what your journey has been like to tech leadership. What are the highlights?
Yeah, highlights. So I went to MIT as an undergrad, and I kind of fell into computer science. At the time, I think 33% of the school was doing computer science. So it wasn't exactly a passion. It was what I ended up doing when I realized that I was not going to be a pure mathematician.
All right.
And then I worked for a series of startups, predominantly in the healthcare space. I think it was an expressed preference that I couldn't have articulated in the beginning, but that I was very interested in healthcare. And I worked for a series of startups. I think one of the things that happens, I think to many of us in our jobs is like, well, I thought I could do it better, or this thing wasn't getting done and I just needed it to get done better. So I stepped up. And so I certainly had a lot of sort of tech lead positions or like light management responsibilities. And then when I joined Flatiron, I was quite a few years on the road. I was a very seasoned engineer. I'd had some management experience and the company was growing. And what happens when companies grow is they're like, who can lead, who can manage people, who can, make this go. And so I was very lucky to kind of get in on an early floor of that and end up running an organization that over time grew quite large, and ultimately becoming the CTO of the company.
Fantastic. So I guess you love startups. I think you love the kind of energy and chaos even.
It's funny because every time I chose a job, I chose a startup. I think the largest company I ever joined was actually Flatiron. It was like 30 people when I joined.
Wow. Okay.
But now I've had the experience of seeing Flatiron grow from a 30-person company to an acquired company to a post-acquisition, enterprise and of 1,200 people. And so I'm now seeing the other side of it. I think something that's also different is 10 years ago, the interest rates were much lower, the cost of capital was much lower. And so I do think that we're seeing at a macro level shifts in what it means to be a startup and what the expectations of a startup are. And at the same time, I've seen sort of the different phases that a company goes through in growth. I've gone through hyper growth. I've experienced, that sort of like, oh my gosh, we're doubling every year or every 6 months experience. And how do I grow a team through that? And I've experienced okay, we now need to like retrench and really think about what is our cost structure for the long term, or what are our new growth opportunities? And I think there's a really big difference between running a mature company and doing a startup. And to be honest, I think that these challenges are actually really interesting. The mature company challenges are kind of fascinating, and in some ways more rewarding. When you are a startup, you run hard at things and you leave tech debt in your wake, and you do whatever you can to like acquire the customers or like get the product out. And not everyone necessarily gets the chance to then get to the, not the end of it, but the next phase of that and say, okay, now this is a proven thing and I need to unwind it and make it a real business. That's actually a really fascinating both leadership and technical challenge that I've really enjoyed.
Wow.
And I think it's, not something everyone necessarily gets to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to see that growth. In fact, I was looking at a chart the other day, when you start off with a small group of people and it turns into a lifestyle business, and then it kind of grows into slightly larger, and there's kind of areas which are really painful as they go through those transitions. So my curiosity is from a tech leader perspective, or any kind of perspective, I don't really care. What have you learned that now that would have been good foundations to help that growth be more smoother?
I'm always worried about being over rotated, right? Because now I'm in the mature business, and my tolerance for, I'll say, technical debt is lower. So I suspect that there's a truth between where I am today and where I was 10 years ago.
Right.
I definitely think that we allowed some technical divergence. So I kind of mentioned at the beginning, Flatiron has a couple of core businesses, and
Yes.
they came about in sort of different ways, and they're operated somewhat differently. And for a long time, and I think this is not unique to us, I think there's a lot of startups, folks were kind of, they were tasked with like, this is your business objective, like go run at it any way you can. And we took a while to have even like centralized help for things like infrastructure. And we certainly have taken a very long time to have very opinionated, centralized ideas about how folks should be approaching things. Not to say that we, I think some ways that could look as a proliferation of languages. We don't have that. We never let someone go write something in Golang, but that's kind of a trope that people joke about, which is like someone's working on something in Python and they're like, this would be so much easier if I did it in Go, or, what at Ruby, whatever they're liking. And you end up with like that proliferation.
Yes.
That's something that I would take a firmer stance on earlier. And I also think that it's very natural as a startup. You're doing a million things and you need to put a lot of autonomy into the individuals at every level. And I think that's great. What I've learned is I don't think autonomy is necessarily antithetical to top-down direction. So I think you can be really clear about what constraints you want people to operate under, what their goals are, and even, somewhat prescriptive about some of the hows without actually significantly diminishing individual autonomy. And that's something that I didn't really understand or have a vibe for 10 years ago, when I was kind of always in startup land and always in the like, I get to do what I want because I'm going to accomplish the goal.
Yes. When you mentioned kind of technical debt, there's all kinds of debt that kind of appears in lots of different kind of forms. And it's interesting you mentioned there about different technologies, because being a software engineer in the past myself, we love the next greatest kind of way of doing stuff. And reining that in is actually quite hard. How do you kind of sell that to your engineers to say, well, we've got to use that technology, or we're not going to use that, and this is the way we're going to go? And how do you choose which one you're going to go with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard and unsolved problem, but you do have the fundamental problem of, let's say, your company uses technology X, and this other group within your company is doing something that's in that space, and they're like, X is fine, but like for this 20% of stuff, like Y would be so much better. So like for our use case, Y is better. Like I know you're using X, but Y is better for us. And it's very hard to come in and say like, nope, you don't get to use Y.
You're right. Yes.
And so I think there's a couple of things that help. I think one is the more your standard offerings are excellent, and like you're never going to expand beyond the constraints of your like the limitations of the tech, but to the extent that is very easy and is a very easy path to use the things that you want people to use. So, if I'm using Python, then I get my CI if I'm using Python, I get my CI/CD for free, and I get, my linting for free, and I get my, all of those things for free. And if I use Go, none of that comes along, and I have to do all that myself. That's a pretty good friction point that prevents people from going down the Go path. So my
Sure.
philosophy, and again, this is the philosophy of someone running a 400-person team, just distinct from, a different size, is the more that you can have a few small, excellent experience paths, that does a lot of the work for you. And I think there are
Mm.
probably a small number of places where a leader needs to step in and say, like, no, we're not doing that. I'm not letting you go down that path.
Yeah, I can just imagine being a fly in that wall in that room. He's trying to kind of. It's a tough equation, and yeah, and also as part of being a CTO, it must be quite challenging because you're dealing with legacy stuff that's been built before, stuff that you need to build now, and obviously where you're kind of taking stuff. How do you kind of navigate that kind of landscape, that time landscape? I mean, do you try to bring legacy stuff up to speed, or do you kind of leave it where it is and try and work with it?
Well, it's not a one size fits all answer, because the real question is, what are your business objectives and what's slowing you down? So if you're spending half your time in KTOL, right, you're spending half your time making the ship not sink,
Mm,
then that is resourcing that you cannot spend towards anything else. And probably that's an area of potential investment. But it's not one size fits all. And even if I think about some of our more legacy applications, it's not even a single answer for the entirety of the application. So maybe it makes sense to rewrite two of the pages that are most frequently used and also cause the majority of our incidents. And maybe it doesn't make
mm,
sense to necessarily retrofit the entirety of the application. So I think a mistake that I may have made in my past, and I think I see technical people make, is a sort of all or nothing thing. Like, testing is
mm,
good, so you should have 90% test coverage, or, cycle time is really important, so your cycle time should always be lower.
mm.
It depends on your problem. I'm in a place where actually I do need cycle time to be lower. Like, that's clearly slowing our development. And if we could get our cycle time to be faster, that would be a huge win.
Mm.
Not in a place where our testing is causing us particular friction. It might in future, like, it doesn't mean that will never happen, but there's a picking and choosing of, like, what is actually impacting your team, where can you buy your people's time back, and what is the business, where are you going, where are you going to be building features in the next 2 years, and where are you absolutely not going to touch.
Fascinating, fascinating. And I just want to take a step back, actually, Catherine. Around, you mentioned that you went to MIT, and I must admit, when you said, "Oh, I went to MIT," I kind of like, wow. I mean, how do you feel about being somebody that's went through that establishment? It's because it's famous worldwide.
I mean, I feel very lucky, because I think if I'd been born 10 years later, I might not have been able to do it. It's getting harder and harder to get into the elite institutions. It was an amazing experience for me. I've made friends there who are with me for my whole life, and
Oh,
the benefit of the network and having those people around me is indescribable. I also feel like, it gives me cred that maybe I haven't earned. I think
uh,
there's always like and I think that people who go to institutions often seek each other out, and there is a criticism leveled at us, which is valid, which is like, you don't have to go to MIT to be a great engineer, a great leader. Like, it is absolutely not required.
mm,
And so I both am very proud and very grateful to have been able to go there, and also just want to acknowledge that, like, great people come from a lot of places, and there's a whole
yeah.
series of events that leads to where you do that.
Mm.
And so, like, that, where I got in when I was 18 is not necessarily the best reflection of, like, who I am today.
That's good. That's good of you to say that, because we have similar universities here. Like, we've got Cambridge, we've got Oxford. I have to say credit to you, for going there. It has gravitas, as they say. And we talked about your journey to CTO. And it's something you said offline, which I kind of loved, is that, CTO, choose your adventure, because CTO isn't quite a very well defined, like, it's not like a pigeonhole that people go in and that's what you do. Speak to that.
Yeah. So, I mean, something that's very clear to me is that, first of all, what the company is going through now is very different from what the company was going through 3 years ago when my predecessor was CTO, which is very different from what the company was going through 6 years ago. First CTO was, working through things. So, first of all, I think phase of company and, like, what's going on in the company dictates a lot of what your CTO role is. So, I spend more time with budgets than, a CTO with a startup, in the sense that a CTO with a startup absolutely has a budget and a cost envelope, but it's pretty simple. It's
Yes.
like you get to grow your headcount by this much and someone else has figured it out for you potentially is what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Whereas, I have tons of vendors, a lot of headcount across all sort of different areas, different choices to make about location-based strategy. And so like a lot of subtleties around our incentive programs. And so my job involves like, frankly, numbers and budgets more than, his did, I think, back in the day, or certainly than most like startup CTOs do. So there's some things that are imposed from the outside.
Mm.
But then I also think that there are things that are there are table stakes for the job, right? You got to keep your org going, like whatever. But there's things that are you can choose the amount of them that you do. So for
Mm.
example, I think an easy one for people to understand is external outreach. Like how much are you a CTO that goes and speaks in order to get your brand out there, either for recruiting purposes or for the, the health and the marketing of the business? That's a choice that, certainly an exec team or a CEO might have a preference around and might hire around, but not every CTO is that person who that's the right thing for them or the place where they're going to get like return on investment for investing their energy. So I think
Yes.
that's a very clear example of something where it's a choose your own adventure. But I think also how deep you get into different parts of the tech is also a choose your own adventure. There are times and places where there's a particular issue and you need to go deep on it. But there's also a little bit of a choice there. Like, do you go deep? Do you get your most trusted architect to go deep? Do you hire a consultant? Do you hire an expert? So, I think that there are choices that can be made along the way about where do you invest your time and energy as a CTO.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also, and all businesses are intertwined into the digital fabric of the world. And you're a technology company. So a CTO actually has, they're directing the direction of the company, so to speak. I mean, how much involvement do you have with the other kind of board members around the direction? Because you've got a on the ground view as to what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we have an executive team. I am on the executive team and absolutely part of the strategic discussions. We are in an interesting situation in that we are wholly owned by another entity, the Roche organization. And so our board situation is perhaps not normal. But I do think that when we talk about CTO, and to some extent, the difference between a CTO and maybe a VP of engineering is potentially, depending on how it's structured, the CTO really being a strategic driver. If your company has a significant tech strategic component, then I think it makes a lot of sense to bring technology to the table so that your technical strategy can mirror and support your business strategy.
So thank you for sharing that, Catherine. I want to again put the spotlight on you. I'm always interested in people's style of leadership. What kind of style of leadership do you have? How do you roll as a leader?
I think this is something that it's observed rather than chosen to some extent, but I think there's a couple things that people would say about my leadership. One is authenticity. So to some extent, this is born of an inability to do it any other way. But I know there are folks who don't like live Q&As, really like to have bullet points when they're talking to folks, really like to have a story complete before they tell it. Kind of the opposite. I actually really struggle to keep secrets. I struggle, I struggle with making conscious decisions about how much of myself to show. So for me, finding a way to navigate and for example, to tell the amount of truth that is valid is something that's like really important to me in my leadership style. So
Yeah.
I do live Q&As regularly, sometimes with like pretty hard questions. And that's a really important part of my leadership style is that I think I do better and show up better when I can really dive in and address things. So what I don't love about prepared statements and prepared presentations, they're obviously important. They're a huge part of how we communicate, but I really like to get into the nitty gritty of, okay, you're telling me that you don't like our technical strategy. I'd love to hear more about that. What do you think our technical strategy is? What are the pieces that aren't resonating? Because I often find that there's a lot of using words non-specifically.
Yes.
And that the more you can get to like what's really going on, which is a conversation, it's not a bullet point, the better the outcome and the more you can align. And there's places where you're never going to align and you just disagree. But so authenticity is one
I love
where
it.
it's sort of table stakes for me.
Yes.
I think something that I've developed and I did not start with is comfort in giving my leaders a lot of autonomy. I think it's actually kind of bound up in the authenticity in the sense that I feel pretty comfortable telling my leaders, this is what I need from you. Here are my guardrails. Here's the like weird, not rational thing that I still want in my head, that you might not want, but I want it. So you have to do it. And here are constraints that are going on, or here are like macro factors that are in my head that I want to be in your head as they do it. And obviously, the more senior leader you're dealing with, kind of the easier this process becomes. It's much harder when you're trying to do this and you're a manager with a new grad. But I am very comfortable letting people solve their own problems. And I think that's because I've seen how often they solve those problems better than I would have done.
Yeah, and that requires a lot of trust. I'm thinking of the 5 dysfunctions of a team, Patrick Lewency's stuff. I think trust is by doing what you're doing, that level of trust must kind of grow over time. And is that something that you've learned over time, or is this something that you've always had implicit in yourself?
I think like many things, it was an instinct, but one that I didn't necessarily hone early on. And in fact, early on, I think what I didn't do a great job of is giving people guardrails. I just assumed that if someone was doing something well, it meant that they totally were like in sync with me and I didn't need to give them a lot of direction. And what I think I've gotten better over time is actually giving more direction and having more asks of my people and being much clearer about what I want their goals to be. And not that assumption of like, well, you were great at, driving this project forward. So you clearly also know that I care about the career development of our team and need you to, make sure the new grads are shepherded. That sort of like guessing game is one that I no longer play. Whereas I think there was a while where I didn't really understand how important that was, or even how to have those conversations in a way that builds the relationship rather than tears it down.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to go back to your authenticity because I think you and I are very similar. I'm very authentic. In fact, a quote came to me about a week ago and it went as follows. People say, think before you speak. Well, actually, speak before you think.
Do you feel like you do that? Do you think before?
I think I do actually, and it gets me into trouble sometimes. But what happens is that the voice that wants to speak into the system gets to say what it thinks, and I filter it to a certain extent. Obviously, you want to be respectful and you want to say what needs to be said, but do it in a way that fits. It's appropriate and timely. But what that quote kind of speaks to is not filtering too much, saying what you really want to say, and being kind of authentic in a respectful way. I don't know if that kind of fits.
I think it's interesting because one of my challenges earlier in my career was speaking too soon. So coming into a meeting and someone says something and I'm like, no, that doesn't work. Or like, here's why I don't agree with that. And it took a lot of like work to build the curiosity that I wait. And I'm like thinking more holistically about this conversation, what this room is, and whether it's advantageous for me to speak now, or whether I should explore more, wait for other people to explore more before I speak up. So I certainly think I have the instinct of being a speak before you think person. And I think actually part of maturing into leadership has had to be, obviously there are things that I can't tell people, right? I'm never going to spoil someone's leaving. That's not an appropriate thing for me to share. There's lots of things that as a leader you're privy to that you can't share all of. Yeah. And so it's more like, how do I make the direct wire where I can sort of quickly process, what is this other person's context and what can I say that is true and authentic within that? And then on the separate side, how do I build the curiosity to wait and to make sure that I am understanding the situation and not jumping in too soon? Yes. Those are the things to work on.
Fantastic. I love it. Great topic, communication and where we show up in that. The other thing I wanted to kind of explore was there's a book that talks about language, speaking as another sense. And as you speak, it changes what's in the space, which then gives you feedback. And then you can kind of navigate the space through a conversation. And I think you described that, going and asking questions, saying what you think. And rather than having kind of fixed bullet points, you use that as a way of exploring what's out there.
100%. I would say different people like to think in different ways. I like to think out loud with a partner. So, and in fact, it's a strength and a weakness because I think it is very hard for me to go off in a room by myself with a blank sheet of paper and come back with a plan. I really need another human to help me. And so maybe someday ChatGPT will be that human, but today, like, I need another human to help me. And I think it's rooted in neuroscience, right? Like language is not separate from how we think. Yep. Language is part of how we're able to grapple with higher level concepts, which is why I think words are really important and specificity is really important. So it totally resonates that the act of speaking is also a creative act in terms of generating ideas.
Yes. Catherine, as we come to the closing arc of our time together, I've got some nice warm questions. The first one is for our aspiring tech leaders that are out there. What would help them on their journey? What advice would you give them based on what you've learned so far?
I think first, cultivate a growth mindset. I did not. I came out of childhood as the smart one. And if I couldn't master something immediately, I thought I was crap at it and I wouldn't do it. And so cultivate the growth mindset and cultivate figuring out how to embody feedback, how to receive feedback, process it, and really bring it into yourself because it's a gift. And when you get it, you need to use it. I think the other thing is to approach your career looking for opportunities, but not being too rigid about what shape they need to be. I think I said yes to a lot of things that I wasn't sure I was going to like, including being CTO. And it's worked out well. And it also would have been okay if I, backed out of some of those things. I think very much about reversible versus irreversible decisions. And I sometimes think that the advice people get to think about their careers leads them to think very narrowly about what they would be okay with. I think thinking about your career in the long term is really important. Understanding where you want to go, what kind of life you want to have is very important. But to some extent, you are also going to be given a set of options as you go through life. And if you say no to one that isn't exactly what you want, you may be extending your timeline or changing what the possibilities are open. So I would say be open to the possibilities in front of you.
Yes, I love what you just said there. Reversible decisions. Decisions don't have to be completely worked out. We can always backtrack. There are, give it a go. You jump into a role, see how that feels, wear it for a bit.
I think I would also add maybe pay a lot of attention to the people around you, focus on relationships. And I think it's relevant in the reversible decision thing too, of like, it's one thing to go into something and say, yeah, I'm definitely committed. I'm happy to do this. And then you hate it. That can really burn that relationship. So again, finding a way to be honest and maintain relationships with people as you go through this experimentation, safe ways to let them know where your head is at, and recognizing that like the job ends, but the people stay with you through your career in some fashion. So really focusing on building relationships early.
That's a beautiful human-centric view. I think that's really important. And it's really interesting that, when you speak to tech leaders, you think they're all going to be about tech, right? But I'm really fascinated because all the tech leaders I seem to speak to, including yourself, kind self, are really human-centric. You really care about your people.
Well, I mean, I think the higher you get in an organization, the less the functional experience is the key thing. So I don't think being CTO is so wildly different from being a COO or a CFO. And at some point, it's all about people. So, as an org of 400, do I spend a lot of time going over individual architecture? I do not. Do I spend a lot of time thinking about org design and like who is best suited to the roles that we have? Yes.
Yes.
And I think that's not different from anyone else with a large organization.
So my question to you then is, do you miss that stuff? Do you miss the geeky stuff?
I thought I would. And there are times when I miss the ability to have a day where you just go in your cave and you tap away. And then at the end of it, you have done a ticket and the ticket is done.
Yes.
And you get a little dopamine and someone says, good job, and it is done. There's a way in which I miss problems that can be solved in a finite amount of time with just me. But I'm also aware, and I think this is an existential problem for a lot of tech leaders. In order to be in it, you got to stay in it. And I'm pretty aware that it's been a long time since I wrote code on a daily basis, and that I'm not in the guts of our tech systems necessarily. So while I still have, a good understanding of architecture, and there's lots of things that I do know, that is a more atrophied skill set. And that's actually, it's kind of hard to grapple with, to realize like, oh, it would actually be a lot of work for me to go back to being an IT engineer. So I wouldn't say I miss it so much as it's, I think, always scary to like lose capacity, as your body gets older or anything, to realize that something that was once available to you may not be anymore.
Yes.
I think that's more how I feel about it.
Yes. As you described that, I'm feeling that actually, because I remember the very last time, I've mentioned it a few times on the podcast, where I checked in, I was using ClearCase, checked in some code, and for the very last time, pressed enter, and I pushed the keyboard away, and I turned to Claudio, actually, I remember him mentioning it. I said to him, that's the last bit of code I've never been back. I've never been back.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you knew when it happened.
Yeah, I remember it. And it was a conscious decision, and that was it. And but I do miss it. That's the strange thing about it. When you describe that, finishing a ticket, that dopamine hit of getting that code or making that LED flash, because I was in the embedded field, that's the most you get. was a great satisfaction. You felt like you delivered some value into the world, you know, and I feel what you feel around business is that sometimes those arcs of delivering value feel like they're endless. They never seem to come to a close, but they kind of do, but it feels like they don't.
Yeah, and I think that like the seeds of what you plant don't get reaped for years. I mean, that's part of why I'm so grateful. I've had 10 years at Flatiron. And so I've actually seen the outcome of decisions that we made play out. But in an ecosystem where people spend 2.5 to 3 years at a job, they're not necessarily seeing all the outcomes of the choices they make.
Mm,
I think that's actually really scary.
yes, yeah,
And I mean, it's again one of these existential, like it's frightening. Like, am I making choices that are gonna be terrible for me 3 years from now? Like,
yes.
hard to know. But I'll take the gift of at least having seen how some of them play out.
And the other curiosity question I have actually for our aspiring tech leaders out there is that once you transition from the what it's probably not the right term, but I'm going to use it anyway. The geeky kind of like phase of your techie kind of leadership to the business side. How did you learn those skills?
I mean, some of it's selection bias, right? In the sense that folks who get pulled into management typically are already the ones who are maybe better communicators, at least seem to have a certain amount of empathy.
Yeah.
So there is some selection bias in that. I do think that it was, watching other people and frankly, learning by failing. I mentioned that, I used to jump in too early on conversations. So I certainly think it's very important to not just like pick people that you want to model yourself after, but like pick specific things about what they do that you want to
Yes.
model yourself after. I certainly don't have like just one boss where I'm like, oh, that's the person and I do everything their way. I think there are moments, even in people that I struggled with, where I'm like, oh, that they did really well.
Yeah.
And so it's some of that. It was a little bit of reading. And in this case, for me, it was like more like pop psychology and to some extent getting into my own head and understanding what makes me tick.
Yes.
And some trial and error. So it's kind of all of those things. And obviously sorry, coaching from my managers and my leadership.
Yes.
But I do think that what is really important about people who are making that switch into leadership, and I would also say this about going from like a line manager or maybe a director that's running like a small organization to something that is more executive, is that it is a skill set that has to be learned. And it feels like a skill set that shouldn't have to be learned. It feels like an innate skill set that people just have. Because, there are charismatic people, there are well-spoken people, like there are kind of people like that. And so recognizing that it is a skill set that is being built is, I think, actually one of the hardest things to navigate. Is like management is a skill set, leadership is a skill set, and you don't, even if you got a good intuition, you don't come to that bag 100% full.
Yes. On the topic of people on their journey to tech leadership, any books or any films or theatre shows even that have kind of molded your journey and really helped you that you'd like to share here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple. I mean, the first I'll mention is Stumbling on Happiness by Dan Gilbert. But so the fundamental premise of Stumbling on Happiness is basically it talks about how we as human beings just really suck at predicting what's going to make us happy. Like our just brain is not designed for it. I don't remember anything else about the book mostly, but that was such a core insight for me that it changed both how I operate personally, but anything you do that changes how you operate personally also changes how you operate professionally. So to some extent, like the biggest piece of advice I have is like, get yourself in order, make yourself like the best version of you can have. So I think anything Stumbling on Happiness was like the first unlock for me in a journey around that. One that I keep going back to these days is called Switch by Chip and Dan.
I've read that. Yep. That's a good one.
The whole bright spots thing has really helped me when you're dealing with anything. I mean, times of change, we're always in times of change. I think boiling the ocean is always tempting. And so I think the narrow lens of like, where is something going well that you can replicate has been really helpful. And I mean, honestly, just like anything that sounds weird, but anything that like makes me like a healthier, stronger person. So people don't talk about this, but you're smarter and better when you get enough sleep. Sorry, new parents. I'm very, very happy for you. And you'll get back to it. But, I know that I really struggle and I am just not my best self when I don't sleep, which is obviously, a personal problem, but it becomes a professional problem. And so thinking about investing in what are the things that make you a less good person? Is it your nutrition? Is it your ability to sleep? Is it even like your comfort in your environment? And recognizing that making you, your kind of making you your best self as the highest percentage of time possible is also an investment that will kind of pay off forever in your professional life.
I totally agree. So I'm part of a number of different leaders in the kind of personal development space. And the one thing, just to underline what you just said there, Catherine, is that sleep is the number one. You can talk about all the others, but if you're not getting the sleep, then forget the others. They're not going to work, or not they're going to work as effective. So you've got to get that right. I can't underline that.
Yeah, I mean, I can still pass, right? I can still like have a
Yeah.
conversation, but there's like some spark that is gone,
Yes.
and my emotional regulation takes a turn for the worse, right?
Yes, that's right. So here we go. Hopefully the podcast has been fun for you, but this is an even funner part of the podcast. I'm going to offer you a wish, okay? I'm going to offer you a wish. I'm going to be the tech genie for a second. What would you wish for from the tech genie, for your leadership, for your industry, for your people?
For my industry, I think that we talked earlier about there was a time that capital was free flowing and there was lots and lots of money. Engineering salaries have become very large. Engineers are very expensive. And I think we're now feeling a little bit of a reckoning of the cost of an engineering team. You know, if I have 5 new grads, I now have $1 million team. And I think we're now having a reckoning with the cost of capital. So these things go in cycles, of course. We're in, a low cycle right now. I think we're starting to come out the other end of it. But I want to land in a healthier place than we started, because I think there was a tech is magic kind of idea that wasn't super healthy. It inflated salaries, which is great for those of us who, got inflated salaries. But I think there needs to be a healthier balance around like tech and what is a sustainable business model, and what, should we reasonably expect of our engineers, and how does that factor in? Because I think we've swung wildly from, oh my God, hire everyone you can, pay them anything, to these people are too expensive, I can't live with it. And I think we need to land in a healthier and stable place. So it's not maybe a very sexy wish, but I want us to get as a community and as a world and an economic organization to a place where we understand better how we should be leveraging tech, and how it plays into our top line decisions and what we should be paying for it.
Yes, this has come up a few times. This whipsawing of hiring people and then firing people. I mean, it affects people's lives, and it also affects the business as well. But it affects people's lives, and it can be quite unpleasant. Hiring fast, lots of people, and then inflating and then going pop, like a balloon.
I'm certainly not going to complain about tech being like the worst hit of, jobs that come and go. There's certainly many folks who have larger complaints about their industries dwindling, and I don't think that's going to happen in tech. But if you think about people trying to make decisions about what do they study, what career path is their life going to have, I think the more we can smooth that and be like, this, you can understand, this is where it's going, rather than the flash of, you can make $1 million in a year, you're going to spend 9 months finding a job and it's going to be terrible. Like, getting to a more more rational place in between would be healthy for all of us.
Fantastic. That's great. So, Catherine, as we come to the full stop of the podcast, unfortunately, what's your final key takeaway that you'd like to offer as a gift to our tech leaders out there?
Everything that broadens your perspective, whether it feels work-related or not, and every investment that makes you feel like you are a better version of you, will pay off in your personal life and your professional life.
What a brilliant note to finish on. Thank you very much for your time, Catherine. It's been wonderful having you on CTO Confessions.
Thank you.
And finally, remember to subscribe to CTO Confessions podcast and IT Labs newsletter, where you get regular tech articles and invites to the IT Labs webinar series. URLs for this can be found at the bottom of this page. We are consistently creating material to create, nurture and support a community of tech leaders. And of course, if you want to know more about IT Labs services, including our Teams as a Service service, please don't hesitate to get in touch. As mentioned in the intro, please think of us like tech leaders' favourite off-the-shelf service, providing agility, high-performing teams off that shelf with a wide breadth of skill and knowledge. Well, that's all, folks. Look after each other and keep safe. Wishing you all a good day or evening wherever you are in the world from all of us here at IT Labs. Live long, live well and prosper until we meet again on the next CTO Confessions podcast.